morning and welcome to another of our daily devotionals. This morning I want to talk to you a little bit about John 20 verse 1 and following. Those verses are part of the Easter narrative and we've really just looked at them, but I wanted to look at them again because there are just a few pieces in there that have been jumping out to me and I just want to look at them a little bit more closely. So if you know John, the Gospel of John has a number of different prominent themes. One of those themes is the theme of creation and the theme of a new creation, and another one of the themes, or perhaps motifs, is this idea of light and dark that John likes to play with, not just here but elsewhere in the writings, in his letters. John, begins his gospel with those famous words "in the beginning," which are a direct allusion to the beginning of the Bible itself, to Genesis 1, where of course it starts, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." Now the earth was formless and empty. Some translations say formless and void. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. Now, that Hebrew word there for formless and void is tohu vavohu. And it's kind of a word that sounds like what it is. It means chaos, formlessness, void, confusion. And into that confusion, in verse 3, it says, "And God said, let there be light." Now, John doesn't waste any time in his gospel, right? He starts with "in the beginning," but then he pretty quickly identifies Jesus with light. In verses 4 and 5 of the first chapter of John, he goes on to say that Jesus is, in him was life, and that life was the light of men, right? And he goes on to use the word light 7 times in just the first few verses of John 1. John goes on to sort of elaborate on his creation theme by overlaying the story with a couple of different groups of 7 that I think are intended to represent the 7 days of creation. First, there are the 7 miraculous signs in John. The first one is at the wedding in Cana, and it says that, John brings your attention to it and says this is the first of the miraculous signs that Jesus performed. And if you count them, thereafter, there are 7, 1 for each day of creation. John also weaves in 7 I am statements of Jesus. And these I am statements are important because it's Jesus making sure that we understand that he's identifying with God himself. Recall that in Exodus 3, that's the name that God gives to Moses. He says to Moses, "I am who I am." Well, John records 7 statements of Jesus saying, "I am the bread of life," for example. "I am the door." And in case you missed John's light connection, one of them is, one of the I am statements is, "I am the light of the world." So John is really playing with these themes, not just in the first chapter of John, but really throughout. So why all this creation? What's John's point? Well, I think he's really trying to show, and we'll dig into this a little bit, but I think he's really trying to show that what Jesus is doing is not just more of the same. It's not a slight adjustment to the course. It's a new creation, a totally new thing. So it's against that backdrop that I've been looking at this Easter narrative. So to John 20, verse 1, the resurrection has already happened and Jesus has been buried. And then it says in 20, verse 1, "Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple and said, 'They've taken the Lord out of the tomb and we don't know where they put him.'" I'm going to skip down a little bit here. The disciples come, John and Peter come. They come racing to the tomb. They look, they see. It says they saw and believed. And then let's skip to verse 10. "Then the disciples went back to their homes, but Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw 2 angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, 'Woman, why are you crying?' She said, 'They've taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they've put him.' At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not realize who it was. But then Jesus says, 'Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for?' Thinking it was the gardener, she says, 'Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've put him, and I will get him.' Then Jesus says to her, 'Mary,' uses her name. She turns towards him and recognizes, who he is. So what's John what picture is he trying to draw for us here? I think it's curious that John takes pains to say that it's still dark when Mary sets out for the tomb. I think John is trying to give us this picture, and I think it's a pretty fair reading to understand the crucifixion as an undoing of creation, as a return to chaos, a descent into tohu vavohu, back into formlessness and the void. But into that darkness, right, this dark moment of the crucifixion and the death of Jesus, there's another let there be light moment, right? Because Mary is lost in darkness. It's the darkest time that's ever been. God speaks again, says, let there be light, and she encounters, remember Jesus says he is the light of the world. So even though Mary sets out while it's dark, she encounters the light of the world there in the garden. She doesn't recognize him at first, but then he calls to her and reveals himself to her, and she sees him. And if you think I'm stretching here, John says it's dark. Then the light of the world, Jesus, shows up. And in case maybe just to erase doubt, John points out that they're standing in a garden, to the point that Mary thinks she is the gardener. So it was dark, light has come, and now they're standing in a garden. I mean, this is as Genesis as it can get, right? So I think John is trying to tell us that the promise of Easter is that promise of a new creation. Humanity, like Mary, is lost in this darkness and chaos. Humanity encounters the light of the world, but like Mary, the light has come in the darkness, so the darkness has not understood it. We don't understand it, but there's hope because Jesus calls out to us by name. He reveals himself to us. The light shines in the darkness. So what does that mean for us? Well, I think there's probably just really 2 points. I think first, John wants us to see the significance, I think, of the resurrection. Like I said, this isn't just a paradigm shift. This isn't just a value add from Jesus. This isn't a course correction. Jesus puts into motion the most fundamental shift, the most fundamental reworking of creation that goes to the atomic level to the cosmic. I mean, it is all-encompassing. It is a brand new let there be light moment. And it starts right then at the resurrection. And I think John wants us to make sure we don't miss that. Second, and this one maybe is a little bit harder to understand. Elsewhere in the Gospels, Jesus tells us that we're going to have to take up our crosses and follow his path. And man, that's a hard word, right? But I think the promise of Easter, and maybe what John is trying to get at here, is that in following that path, which is going to lead us into chaos, it's going to lead us into darkness, it's going to lead us into tohu vavohu. Even in those moments, the promise of Easter is that light will come. In John 12, and then again, Jesus says this, and then Paul says it in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, for a seed to grow, it's got to die first. And we hate the process of dying. We hate the idea that we've got to take up our cross. But that's a part of the story. And I think this is a reminder to us, a promise that, like Mary, we've got to get up while it's still dark. We've got to go out into the darkness. And it's, I think, John's trying to communicate to us that there's no darkness. There's no valley of the shadow of death. There's no tohu vavohu that's so dark that God can't speak into it, let there be light. So today, if you have time to meditate on John 20, I'd encourage you to do it. I think we've only really scratched the surface with this. Spend some time maybe reading that and reading John 1 and seeing what parallels you can find between Genesis and John, and maybe read through John and find those I am statements. See what else you can find. I know there's more here, and we know that God's word never returns empty. So see what you can find.